His tough driving, his sharp tongue, and his snappy off-track style made him a unique racing personality. An early superstar who never really stopped racing into his 80s. Today on NASCAR Past Champions, we look at two-time titleist Buck Baker.
In 1939, Buck Baker was making his living driving in Charlotte, driving a city bus. It was during driving one of those bus routes he decided to try his hand at race car driving. The decision changed his life. Hi, and welcome to NASCAR Past Champions. I'm Mike Joy. Making himself noticed among names like Petty and Flock, Buck Baker quickly molded his reputation as a hard-nosed, never-give-up driver around the short tracks of the Carolinas. In a diversified career that included modifieds, Grand Nationals, and open-wheeled cars, Baker etched his place in NASCAR history over 4 decades.
At age 34, Buck Baker got a late start as a full-time stock car racer, but in true Buck style, his first race put him right on the map.
He got out of the Navy and went with a bunch of friends to a race in Greensboro on an old dirt track up there. And before they had run 2 heat races, he got up. And everybody said, "Where are you going?" He said, "Well, they're not doing anything I can't do, you know." So they kind of ribbed him and got home, and they built him a race car. And we had an old announcer in Charlotte, North Carolina, Grady Cole. And we went to Midland, North Carolina. They had a little racetrack down there. That was my dad's first race. And let me tell you, you talk about a whirlwind. He would go off one corner, go down. There was a return road that went on the outside, and he'd come up on the back straightaway, and he hadn't lost any positions. He'd missed the racetrack and went right over the hill, went down, got on the return road. And Grady Cole, after about 5 or 6 of these attempts, said, "I don't know who he is, but if he lives long enough, he's going to be pretty special."
Early on, Buck's driving style created excitement on the racetrack. After 3 seasons, Buck finally found victory lane in 1952 at Columbia, beating the man that would become his great rival, Lee Petty. It was the beginning of much bigger things.
He just came out of the, as far as I can recall, the dirt track racing and fairgrounds racing, like so many of those guys did. Buck was he occupies a very high place in my memory bank because he was probably more good quotes per mile than anybody in racing. He just had a gift for talking about his sport that was a delight to a writer or someone trying to cover it. And he was tough. Man, he was a tough guy.
1953 was the season that put Buck on the map. 4 wins in his Olds 88, including the prestigious Southern 500. He would win 7 times over the next 2 years. Buck's on-track success, coupled with his cool off-track persona, made him an early superstar.
He won in midgets. He won in dirt cars. He won road course races. I mean, he was just good anywhere that you put him. And he was the type of guy that could take a race car that didn't have to be perfect and make it work. And I guess you call that talent. Of all the people I ever watched on a half-mile dirt racetrack, I think my dad was as good as anybody I ever watched, and I watched the best.
Well, Baker was an all-time great on any racetrack he ever drove, and if he had a car that was even halfway equal to some of the other cars, he'd outrun them. He was a heck of a race car driver on dirt, and he was good on asphalt too. Of course, we didn't have too much asphalt to run back then, but he was good on the rough racetrack, and he's really good on a real slick racetrack.
Buck was a pretty much of a gentleman. He was a tough driver, but he was very quiet. He wasn't loud or boisterous or nothing. Of course, none of them really were. But to see him and go back and think about the way Buck was, he kind of had the Hollywood look to him. And I think that he attracted a lot of ladies that were fans of his. And
Buck Baker's style drew a fan following, but his crusty attitude and take-no-prisoners driving style would make him a champion. As Buck Baker made a name for himself in the 50s, he crossed paths often with another gruff character who became his big on-track rival, Lee Petty. Those two had some fierce battles.
If anybody could match Lee Petty for being ornery, it was probably Buck Baker, and just as tough a competitor.
There was an ongoing basic disregard for each other's welfare if you're on this track the same time I am. You know, they were guys that were give no quarter guys, and they knew if it gets down to you and me, buddy, you know, I'm ready for you, and I know you're ready for me, you know, sort of the thing.
You know, we're talking about a person that was brought up in a time after the war when times were hard. Race car drivers were hard. Nobody had ever said, well, you don't need to say that. You don't need to do this. A lot of times, doggone it, just didn't get it done, you know? These were tough, tough men. I mean, Lee Petty he was rigid. My dad was the same way. All those guys, I mean, they had to fight for everything they got in life. And boy, sometimes I think if they just take some of these guys that whine and cry and whimper about everything that goes on, if they take them and make them live 1 week, like that bunch did, when they got out of the cars, and hey, they'd come down to they didn't come down to talk. If they come in your pit area, you better be ready. Sometimes they had to mix it up a little bit, but it built that racing core that we all have enjoyed over the years. Without a Buck Baker, without a Lee Petty, without Red Byram, even, you know, you just wouldn't have anything. You have to have a history, and buddy, we had one.
In 1956, Buck joined the super team of the era when he became part of Carl Kiekhaefer's stable. The demanding Kiekhaefer had already earned a title the previous year with another superstar, Tim Flock. Buck and his Chrysler seemed a perfect match as he dominated the season. With 14 wins, 31 top fives, and 39 top tens, Buck easily beat runner-up Herb Thomas for the title.
Buck was savvy enough. He didn't use up his equipment, and he went when he had to. I think that Buck's ability can be measured by the fact that he was one of the stars of Carl Kiekhaefer's Chrysler team. Kiekhaefer was the most demanding person I ever met in my life, and if Buck hadn't been a fabulous driver, he would not have been part of those Chrysler teams. Despite his success, Kiekhaefer left the sport the following year. Buck moved on undeterred by Kiekhaefer's withdrawal. Fielding his own cars, Buck teamed with ace mechanic and engine man Bud Moore and set out to defend his title. Not missing a beat, Buck rolled up 10 wins, 30 top fives, and 38 top tens en route to another championship.
When he won somewhere, he said, well, I was supposed to, you know, I'm good enough, I should have. I mean, he was one of those people that could say it and back it up. And when he won championships, he won with Bud Moore. And in '57, when the factories were much into racing, and everywhere we'd go, I mean, he was the guy to beat.
You know, I was really the crew chief and chief mechanic and all on the car that Buck Baker drove. And Baker was really the car owner and the driver, you know, as far as the '57 championship was concerned.
With his second Grand National title, Buck is in NASCAR's history books as the series' first ever back-to-back champion. Buck Baker continued to field his own cars 6 times over the next 3 years. By now, his success on the track, blended with his off-track antics and wit, had built up an outrageous legend.
He always had a very, very amusing way of couching circumstances, and some of the things he did are just absolutely outrageous. But for example, one time at Darlington, it's real hot, and of course back then all the drivers had water bottles or water jugs in the car with them, and sipped water through a long plastic tube, whenever they needed to refresh themselves in those conditions on Labor Day down there. One time Buck didn't have water in his jug. It was tomato juice. And I guess it's probably debatable whether it was laced with vodka or not. But anyway, Buck was in an accident that day and his car turned over. And when it did, all the tomato juice came pouring out of the jug all over Buck's spiffy white driving suit. He always was dressed just right. And Buck was angry that he had the accident. And rather than riding in the ambulance or the wrecker back to the garage area, he started walking through the infield. Well, he left a trail of passed out women in his wake when they saw that uniform with all this tomato juice on it. They thought he was bleeding to death.
I remember the first story I wrote when I came to Charlotte from Greenville was in the paper in April of '57, I guess it was. The NASCAR had just passed a rule limiting the carburation on the Grand National cars. They were taking away the fuel injectors and the superchargers and things like that that had been allowed at that time. And I called Buck up and said, hey, this rule just came through. And right away he said, well, that'll be like, he said, well, here we are getting ready to go to Daytona. He says, that'll be like running mules at the Kentucky Derby, you know. Oh, what a quote. Thank God that I've got this guy from my first story to talk to, you know.
In 1959, after watching his father's incredible success on the racetrack, Buck's son Buddy decided to follow Dad into the driving ranks. Making the decision was easy for Buddy, but working up the nerve to approach his father about a car was another story.
It took me 3 attempts because my dad was real funny. I mean, it was, there's many parts to the story, but when I finally got enough courage to walk up to Buck Baker, who was running for a national championship at the time, and to tell him I wanted to take one of his cars out of the stable and start racing. I went up and I said, Dad, and he went, what? Oh man, this isn't the time. So I turned around and went back over and I worked on the race car a little bit and walked back over and I said, Dad, and he said, what? I went, boy, it's really not the time now. So the third time I went over, I said, Dad, he said, before you say anything else, what do you want? I said, I'd like to start racing. And he just kind of looked at me and he said, well, see that old car in the corner over there? Well, it's a car he hadn't run in a year or two. I thought I was talking about something that was in the stable at that time. There was an old car over there with all the parts to it. He said, there it is. You want to run? Get some people together, get the car together. And I can remember going to Columbia, South Carolina. Whew. And I thought, man, this is a dog car. You know, I was running last, and you're running against Curtis Turner and Lee Petty and Buck Baker, and I mean the best at that time. And I was out there, I was from one corner to the other. I was up against the wall, down on the bottom, and I was sliding around. I went, wow, this car is awful. Well, first guy ever put a fender on me, my dad's leading the race, and he whacked me and put me right out in the infield. Didn't say anything, backed up and got back out there, dropped the green flag again. Well, my dad's car, it blew up. So he came out on the side of the racetrack and motioned me in. He got in that dog car, made up the lap I was already down, finished in third, and he was that far off the second place. And I went, I got a lot to learn.
Buddy had dreamed of racing his dad on the track, but once he got his chance, the reality wasn't quite as good as Buddy's dreams.
So it took me about 8 years. I mean, I really worked hard, and I could go other places and do well, you know, but Winston Cup, I don't care. It wasn't any different back then than right now. There were certain people that you had to deal with every week, and you were not going to beat them until you got good enough. And I can still remember the first time that I passed my dad in a racing condition. And I thought, that's going to be the greatest day in my life. And I went, as soon as I got by him, I went, that wasn't so special after all. That's my hero. And if you could turn the clock back and have us both at the same age, it still whacks my tail, so.
With both Buck and Buddy behind the wheel, the Baker legacy was secure in NASCAR forever. 1960 proved to be another fruitful year for Buck Baker. He finished fourth in the championship with 2 wins, one of which came at Darlington in dramatic fashion. Piloting his Jack Smith-owned and Bud Moore-prepared Pontiac, Buck suffered a blown tire with a lap and a half to go, but held on to take the checkered flag over Rex White to win his second Southern 500.
I blew the tire going in number 3 turn, and whenever I was coming around, I had intended to come into pits, and the people were waving at me from the grandstand to go on, and the pits down there, they were waving for me to go on, and I couldn't quite tell whether they were cheering me or booing me or trying to tell me to stop or what, but I got the signal to go, and I went all around on the rim and won the race on a flat tire, and I think maybe that's probably one of the highlights. There's many in my life because I've lived a long time and I've had a lot of things to happen.
Buck Baker was a heck of a race driver. He was one of the best that came along back in the 50s, late 40s and 50s, on up into the 60s. And I really enjoyed working with Buck Baker, and I remember the first race that we ran, we won, and we won several races in 57 with Baker. I don't remember now how many, but we ran a lot of races. But we won a lot of them too.
Buck soldiered on, winning twice more over the next 2 years. By 1964, he'd been racing full-time for 15 years when he climbed into Ray Fox's Dodge for the Southern 500. And at the checkered flag, the crusty veteran had outfoxed the young guns, David Pearson and Richard Petty, to earn his 46th Grand National win.
Buck Baker was too old to run, as far as I was concerned, to run Darlington. 64, I think it was. So anyway, Buck wanted to drive the car. His son was driving one of my other cars. And Buck wanted to drive the car, and I said, and to myself, I didn't let Buck hear me say it. I said, well, God, he's 50-some years old. I said, yeah, he ain't a very good driver, 50, especially Darlington, which was a tough racetrack to start with. Damn if he didn't win the race. So that threw that out the window. But he was a fabulous driver, fabulous driver.
It was Buck's 3rd career win at the famed Darlington.
One of the great tests of drivers in the early days was Darlington. The only superspeedway we had there from 50 until 58. And Buck won there 3 times. So you got to understand that if you can get around there, you can get around a racetrack. And so your skill and ability really come to the fore in a track that requires that kind of talent.
His win in that Southern 500 would be Buck's final Grand National victory. He continued to race in Grand National and NASCAR's new Grand American Series, where he had 9 wins until 1973. Buck finally hung up his helmet after a late model stock car race in South Carolina in 1977 at age 63. 2 years later, he started a high-performance driving school that would influence NASCAR's future stars. After retiring from racing, Buck Baker formed the first commercially successful oval track driving school. He may have taught future stars at his school, but never lost his competitive edge. The Buck Baker Driving School influenced a new generation of drivers, including future champion Jeff Gordon, who turned his career focus to stock cars after one day with Buck Baker.
I really didn't know what I wanted to do at the time. I went to a few different driving schools, ended up at Buck Baker's driving school, and right there I had my mind made up. You know, I wanted to go stock car racing, and had the opportunity to get a ride when I was at Buck's school.
With 631 starts, 46 wins, and 2 championships, Buck Baker remains one of NASCAR's great champions of an era that defined the fabric of the sport.
Buck is very fierce and very tough to deal with. He let you know right quick that you wasn't going to run over him or push him around or anything of that. I think Buck Baker is one of the greatest drivers that's come along.
He was a great driver, very aggressive, very colorful. I think he was one of the premier early legends of the 50s and 60s that we should never forget.
My father was from an era that probably didn't get the recognition that it should have. And I feel like my father and Lee Petty and those guys, they're part of what we're all about. And they're part of what Jeff Gordon and all that group were about. Without a good fan base and the desire to win and all the things that Buck Baker represented, without those kind of people, we wouldn't have the sport we have today. He was as good as anybody I ever watched in my life, and not just because he's my dad. He just had that special something about him. I mean, when he went with Carl Kiekhaefer and started driving for Mercury outboard Chrysler 300s, he was unbeatable. I mean, there was times that they were accusing him of cheating, and people were doing this in the group, and they were doing that, and it wasn't that. It was just a lot of people are special, and my father was that way.
In his later years, Buck Baker continued to defy the odds and kept ruling his racing school with an iron fist well into his 80s. In 1998, during NASCAR's 50th anniversary, Buck Baker was honored as one of NASCAR's 50 greatest drivers of all time, joined on the list by his son Buddy. The Baker family racing legacy, which spanned 6 decades of NASCAR, would be secure for future generations to admire. For NASCAR Past Champions, I'm Mike Joy. Thanks for joining us.